Hi, Ms. Salcedo. Good afternoon. Since I am the group leader of Group 1's Discussion Board 7 of Ben Jonson and his poem, Honor My First Son, I am conducting the video presentation of the conclusions that the group arrived to. Before I go into the group's analysis, I would like to point out a few things that I found interesting about this poem. Firstly being that the editors David Damrosch and Kevin J.H. Detmar within the Longman Anthology of British Literature note that Jonson was the stepson of a bricklayer, who became a poet laureate. Merriam-Webster defines poet laureate as a poet appointed for life by an English sovereign as a member of the royal household who was formally expected to compose poems for both court and national occasions. Furthermore, I found that Jonson's piece on My First Son was rather interesting because in the footnotes of On My First Son within the Longman Anthology of British Literature, it notes that this particular piece is based on 3 poems of invitation by the Roman poet Martial. After doing a bit of research about this, because I wanted to find out more about it, I found that Encyclopedia Britannica noted that Martial, who was otherwise known as Martial Valerius Martialis, who was born March 1st around 38 to 41 AD in Biblis, Hispania, which is now known as Spain today, and died around 103 AD. He was a Roman poet who brought the Latin epigram to perfection and provided in it a picture of Roman society during the early empire that is remarkable for both its completeness and for its accurate portrayal of human foibles. I'm so sorry if I butchered that word. So, I just thought that was rather interesting and I wanted to share that. Both individually and as a group, we analyzed Jonson's poem, On My First Son, and we came to some interesting deductions. As a group, we came to a consensus that the poem's dramatic situation centers on a father who is grieving over the loss of a 7-year-old son. We arrived at this conclusion by looking at lines 1 through 5 within the poem, which reads, "Farewell, thou child of my right hand and joy. My sin was too much hope of thee, loved boy. 7 years thou wert lent to me, and I thee pray, exacted by the fate on the just day. Oh, could I lose all father now." From this information, we come to an understanding that the father has lost that feeling of being a father. And ultimately, he is self-sabotaging himself. He's beating himself up because maybe somewhere inside of him he feels as if this is some kind of punishment at some point early in the poem, that was one of the things that I felt from it. So he feels as if he has lost the feeling of being a father. He doesn't want to do that anymore. Another thing I should have pointed out in my paper, which I didn't, is that particular sentence syncs up with the psychology term known as disassociation. Disassociation is a tool that anyone who is going through a traumatic event will go through. And disassociation deals with splitting off from that part of life, from the part of life that hurts you. You're trying to wipe it away from you and ignore it. You don't want to look at it. You don't want to deal with it. So you ultimately separate yourself from it. And I feel that that is another thing that was going on within this poem here. So in this, the father has lost that feeling of being a father. And he feels a lot of guilt and sorrow for this loss. And it's ultimately because he had such high hopes and aspirations for his son, which ultimately any parent would. And then having your child suddenly taken away from you, that would just cause anyone to lose it. So, furthermore, as I am a psychology student, I found this poem very interesting. And I wanted to bring forward the fact on video, which I know I noted this on paper, but I'd like to bring it forward again, is that I found this particular poem interesting because I feel that it really emanates the Kubler-Ross model, which is otherwise known in psychology as the 5 stages of grief. Authors Don and Sandra Hockenberry within the psychology textbook note that in 1969, psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross proposed that the dying, and also those that are dealing with such a loss as death, go through 5 stages. I apologize, I just lost my place here. Okay. First, they deny that death is imminent, and perhaps they insist that their doctors are wrong. And they start denying the seriousness of their illness. Second, they feel and express anger that they are dying. And a third, they try to make a deal with doctors, with relatives, with even God, promising to behave in a certain way if only they may be allowed to live. Fourth, they become depressed. And finally, fifth, they accept their fate. So one thing I failed to point out in my paper when I brought forward the 5 stages of grief is that though in psychology this is a model, it is not set in stone because ultimately we're individuals, we're unique. And when dealing with something as grief and loss, especially in the subject of death, we're all going to deal with that in our own way. And it ultimately depends on our mindset, our own personal views of how we view death, and it also depends on just who we are as a person. So one person may be able to pretty much carry forward. Yeah, they may be upset about it, but they'll be able to move on. Another person, especially, I know for me, if it was someone that was really close to me, I would lose it. And ultimately, I would go through these 5 stages of grief. They may not show up one after another. I may get depressed before I get angry. And that's what I'm trying to point out here is that it's not something set in stone, but it does present a model that somewhere the people are going to go through all 5 of these stages in some way or form. Excuse me. Okay, so onward with the analysis here. As a group, we discussed how the problem raised within the poem is resolved within the last 4 lines of the poem. And it was rather interesting to see that though we each may have stated this in different ways, we again arrived at a consensus that the father within this poem, he goes through these emotions and then he goes through the task of burying his son, which exemplifies he's putting his son to rest. He is dealing with the process of the grief and loss, and that he is ready to bury his son and ultimately ready to move forward with his life in some way or form. So one other thing that I recognized when I was writing out this outline for the video presentation is that burying someone is I'm so sorry for saying, I lost my place here. It's a cultural ritual. It is a cultural ritual that people will go through to, let go of someone that they have lost. So I found that rather interesting too. And lastly, we looked at the last set of lines, which presented a paradox within the poem. And again, Merriam-Webster defines paradox as something such as a situation that is made up of 2 opposite things that seem impossible but actually are true or possible. By our group individually looking at the paradox presented within this poem, we came up with some very interesting conclusions. Excuse me. For instance, fellow group member Nicholas Perez arrived at the conclusion that the paradox of Jonson's poem centers on love. He states that the more excessively one loves, the harder it becomes to let go when the time comes, such as a parent and a child in the time of death. I found that very interesting that he stated that. And I felt that I should bring that forward in the video presentation here. Another point that was interesting was fellow group member Brandon Bell's deduction that the paradox within Jonson's poem centers on love and letting go, as he states that the more you love something, the harder it will be to part from it in the end. And I found that to be a very wise thought. So then, yet another group member of Group 1, Catherine Smith, breaks down the paradox of this poem in a very interesting way. Within her work, she states that within Jonson's work there is a paradox in regards to grieving, that Jonson lets go of his fatherly feeling, which we noted earlier in line 5. And he later states in line 12, as what he loves may never like too much. Here Jonson wishes that the feelings of love did not have to be so strong, so to make parting easier, this desire for love to simply fade so that there is no longer the sting of loss is ultimately a desire that spans the century. And I thought that that was very interesting as she connected Jonson's poem to the subject of death and loss, which is something that society as a whole has a hard time dealing with. So, fellow group member Krista Jonson also presents an interesting view within her work in regards to the paradox of Jonson's poem. Within her work, she states that the message that the paradox relays is that we must love while we can. Don't overlove, but love equally. She goes a step further within her deductions, and she connects Jonson's poem to the work of William Shakespeare by stating that she felt that this poem went hand in hand with Shakespeare's words about time. And she goes on to state that there is never enough time, and time is the most precious thing on earth. And I found that to be rather interesting, as I myself noted the paradox as time within Jonson's poem, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. But I found that rather interesting. So, as I said, that I concluded that time related to the paradox presented in Jonson's poem. I stated that it relates to time, which points to the realization that nothing lasts forever, and that all things at some point must face death. So, it is very interesting to recognize that though we arrived at some different conclusions, yet again, it's almost as if we were reaching the same conclusions, just said differently. So, lastly, before I close this video, I wanted to note that one thing I found rather interesting about Jonson's work is that Jonson pays a tribute to the poet Martial, the Roman poet Martial, within the last lines of this poem, which are lines 9 and 10, that read, "For whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, and what he loves may never like too much." This particular line in the poem shows that the father has come to terms with his son's death. But in it, it's also paying tribute to the Roman poet Martial. So, I noted within the footnotes in this poem that's in the Longman Anthology of British Literature that it is bringing forward a particular set of lines, 8 through 11, from Martial's poetic work that is found in the Epigrams Book 12. Which, this is Book 12, Part 34, lines 8 through 11, which states, "If you wish to be aware of sorrows that gnaw the heart, to no man make yourself too much a comrade. I feel that that is some very wise words, and as we are human beings, it is ultimately hard for us to love but not love too much, be a friend but not be too much of a friend, because psychology wise, we're all social animals. We want that companionship, we want that friendship, we want the connection with other people. We're all sociable creatures. So I also feel that ultimately this is stating to not take anyone for granted. And it's like what other members of the group said. Time is precious, and people are precious, and you should cherish them. So ultimately, I found that the deductions everyone came to in the group was very interesting, and that this particular poem within the Renaissance era was very fascinating, as ultimately I feel it syncs up with the Kubler-Ross model, or the 5 stages of grief. And it makes me wonder if that wasn't what Jonson was trying to do within his work, was give readers some hope in dealing with such a loss as death. So, thank you for listening to my video presentation over Group 1's analysis of Ben Jonson's poem, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a good week. Thank you.